Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Dubcast with Dubside. I'm Andrew Alzaga. Dubside is away this week, so today I'll be talking with photographer Kiliii Yuyan. Kiliii is an award-winning contributor to National Geographic magazine and other major publications, including Outside, Time, Bloomberg Businessweek, Wired, and many others. He also had a short documentary titled Anaiyyun, Prayer for the Whale, which documented a traditional bowhead whale hunt in Alaska, and which has screened at several film festivals, including the Seattle International Film Festival. I first met Kiliii years ago at the South Sound Traditional Inuit Kayak Symposium and got to know him for his skin-on-frame kayaks as well as for his expertise in primitive skills. Welcome, Kiliii, and thanks so much for agreeing to be on the show.
Well, it's very nice to be here, Andrew. Yeah, it's nice to talk to you after so much time.
Yeah. So, how did you first become interested in indigenous communities and especially the people of the Arctic?
Well, it's kind of a funny roundabout story. I mean, I think really it all comes down to the fact that my grandmother's Nanai, which is East Asian indigenous or Siberian native. And when I was a kid, she raised me to a large degree. And she was always telling me stories, crazy stories about boys who rode on the backs of sturgeons and killer whales and were transforming into seals and things like that. And I think when I trace it back, I sort of think that those are the things that fired up my imagination that got me going and eventually led me to being interested in native peoples as well as sort of our traditional life ways. Because for the longest time, I didn't actually know that my grandmother was an indigenous person. Like when you grow up as I would call a third culture kid, you grow up between cultures, but then in a different culture than your parents, there's a lot of things that are lost in translation. It takes a long time in your life to piece together the bits, especially for immigrant parents who are just trying to get by and try to instill values in their children. That so I think that has a lot to do with it. I certainly was interested in a lot of traditional living skills long before I knew that I was indigenous. But after that time, after I kind of learned and understood the family history a little bit better, I then really came around to it and started to spend a lot more time around native communities, especially in the north, in the Arctic. Mm-hmm. And so the Arctic's always captured my imagination. But I mean, at Nanai, we are a subarctic people. We live in a region of the world in Siberia, or the Russian Far East, rather, that is extremely cold in the winter. It's one of the coldest places on Earth, but also quite warm in the summer. It's called boreal jungle. So it's sort of a natural for me to be attracted to a place like that, to the Arctic regions and the subarctic regions, because they share so much. People of the North we all share a lot of understanding about things, and chiefly of which is that probably the biggest thing is that I am always too hot everywhere I go. So the Arctic is one of the few places where I feel really comfortable.
How did you get involved in primitive skills then? How old were you and what got you interested in it?
Well, it's hard to say exactly when. I was interested in a lot of things like hunting. I was making my own bows and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of it was before there was I knew there being such a thing as primitive skills per se, learning how to hunt and fish and stuff, even when I was in high school. But then I got involved in the primitive skills community, which is a sort of a global movement of people that are interested in pre-metal living skills. And there's sort of a universality to it. Yeah, that was probably when I got out of college. So a few years after I got out of college, I found that community and I found it to be very interesting. Some really amazing people and all kinds of interesting stuff going on. So I spent the next decade around that and learning as much as I could from people out there and just doing it and living it.
Was there an overlap in the primitive skills community with traditional kayak building and traditional kayaking?
Not really. It's interesting. I think I was the I was the bridge for sort of these bushcraft skills and with skin on frame or traditional kayak building. There should probably be a natural link there because so many of the skills are very similar. when we build kayaks, we are tying them together with sinew, and we are doing hide work in order to sew the skins up around them. Doing a bunch of you're doing steam bending and woodworking using traditional techniques, Morse and tenon joints, and all this kind of stuff. That is stuff that in the primitive skills world is stuff that you learn. And the kayak is sort of like the advanced application of a lot of those things. It's interesting, actually, as a traditional skin boat builder, it gave me a huge advantage actually when I was learning to build these boats, because I already understood so many of the traditional techniques that were required to build them using a lot of the original methods of doing it. But it wasn't until really that I started spending time, until I sought out elders and skin boat builders in the far north that are still alive, or were still alive at that time, that I eventually learned how to do the skin sewing properly. So it's been a long journey for me. There's another kind of funny coincidence to all of this too, which is interesting, is that when I began kayak building, I wasn't doing it because I knew that it was part of my heritage, but I later found out that our traditional craft were likely to be the origin of all kayaks. The shapes of our boats, etc. Yeah, were supposedly the influence for kayaks further north. And even more interesting is that the influence came back down south, and as our birch bark kayaks started to fade, people began making skin boats out of it. So for several centuries, we were building traditional kayaks using a lot of the same techniques as people of the far north, and that's where our kayaks came from. So I was doing sort of one of the most unique things about our culture without even realizing it. But it didn't take me that long to figure it out.
Oh, wow. So they were originally covered with birch bark.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we have several types of boats, but the ones that are the most kayak-like were originally birch bark. There was definitely a lot of overlap. Like you definitely find skin boats next to birch bark canoes or birch bark kayaks that have the same hull shapes and are just skinned with different things, different materials.
Tell me about trying to find these elders who knew some of the traditional techniques on how to sew a kayak together. How did you go about
Well,
kind of doing that?
yeah, I did some projects where I sewed the skins around some of my kayaks, and learned a lot in the process. But there's only so much that's really available in books. And at that time, too, I mean, this was probably 2004 or something like that. There's just hardly anything out there in terms of books, et cetera. Now you can find some of that kind of stuff in some of Harvey Golden's books, and there's random obscure journals and things that have some information in them, but there really was just not very much out there. And after I built my first few, I realized that I needed to learn where to do the skin sewing from. So I was trying to look up different places. I knew that there's some Aleut Unangan elders that still know how to do it, and other folks across North Alaska. But eventually, when I went up to the town of Barrow, or which is now known as Utqiaġvik, I went up there to work on my story, People of the Whale. And when I was there, I just became a part of the community. I spent enough time over there with whaling and being part of the community over there that I eventually got to know everybody. And then I met the skin boat sewers, who to this day are still sewing bearded seal or ugruk skins on their traditional umiaks, and still hunt whales from them. So every spring, all the women who are skin sewers get together and they sew skins on all the umiak that are up there. So there's quite a lot of extant knowledge of it up there. Now it's not exactly the same stitches as the kayaks, but it's a real living skill that still exists, and they're very good at it. And so I was able to learn from one of the women and elders up there, Patricia Sage, who showed me how to do some of the stitching. And she's passed away now, so it's kind of a crazy thing to think that slowly all of this is disappearing as well. But there's been a real resurgence too, so we're not really afraid. I don't think about our skills generally as a thing that's commonly media like to talk about it as we are losing everything. Our skills are, it's gonna the last skin boat or the last blah blah blah. It's not really like that. When you actually look around at the indigenous community, you see that things like a lot of our traditional skills, people in my generation and younger are bringing it back. We're actually much more quote unquote traditional, or we've learned a lot of our ancient cultural techniques and traditional ways of doing things than the generation before us. We speak better language and know how to do a lot more of our traditional cultural practices. So it's kind of amazing. We're seeing it happen all over the world, not just in the Arctic.
So the preservation of traditional skills is growing.
Yeah, and I would say it's not even preservation isn't even quite the right word. It's preservation is what you do in Svalbard with the seeds. You stick it in a vault and then you lock it up and try to keep it safe forever. But really, for Native peoples, we aren't preserving them. It's like almost the opposite of them. We're making them come alive. They are coming back to life, and as all of these practices live forward, more and more people are doing them, and so it just keeps it alive in this completely different way. So it's a wonderful thing.
Watching your film about the whale hunt, I was really impressed by this umiak that they were paddling.
Oh, uh-huh.
Looks so sleek. It moves so well in the water with the real skin. And how did you get involved in making that film?
Well, um, I was, I mean, making the film, it just came about as a byproduct of being out there working on the story for National Geographic.
Okay.
I started that project as a personal story originally, as a personal project originally for the first 2 years or so before the Geographic came on board to help support it and eventually to publish the story. But, at this point in time, I've now spent, 6 years? 6 years, because I wasn't there in 2020 because of the sort of obvious reasons
Yeah.
with COVID. But I've been there every spring whaling season since then. And when you're shooting still photography and doing that kind of work, especially up there during whaling season, there's a lot of time when you are just standing there in the flow of everything that's going on. But there's a lot of long moments when not much is happening. You can easily be standing out there and watch for 12 hours and not have anything notable happen at all. If the whales aren't coming through at that time, they're too far away, and other animal migrations are far away. You really can be looking at not much going on at all. So once I had shot everything that I could in still photography, I began to switch over to shooting some video. And eventually I realized, after I came home with a bunch of video, I realized that I should really make a film about what was happening up there. And, in the process too, I think I understood that it's not, I'm not the first person to do a documentary film about whaling of the Utqiaġvik up north, but I think all of those documentaries really have like a very particular point of view, and they tend to be very Western and colonial. There are people like they're looking at all of that kind of stuff as sort of being very exotic, with a lot of cultural biases. It's either kind of in favor of whaling or against whaling. And I think I realized then that in making a film, I would be one of the few indigenous peoples to really do a film and to look at it still as an outsider, because I'm not from that community, but with a cultural perspective that was much closer. That's one of the reasons why there's no narration. There's hardly any words in there at all. It's almost cinema verite in a sense, yet you still get the story. Because the point of it is not to interpret for people, but to really just show them what is happening up there, to pull out a pure strain of what it means to be, what whaling is to Inuit people up there.
Well, it's a beautiful film. The footage is amazing.
Thanks.
Definitely there are some things that you've decided to not show. I was curious about the choice to not show the actual harpooning or shooting or killing of the whale, or the butchering of the whale.
Or the Nanook. Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's it wasn't that much of a struggle for me, honestly. because this is a question that has been hashed out at National Geographic, and also a question hashed out with the Alaskan Eskimo Whaling Commission, which you need a permit for to be out there on the ice at all. I worked with the AEWC to make sure that the story we were telling would be something that wasn't going to shut down their subsistence whaling. Like they had to fight long and hard to make that happen, to regain control, to manage their own whales. At that time, before the film came out, it was still very much in flux. Like the possibility was that the International Whaling Commission, which is deadlocked on this issue of indigenous whaling, every year they would have to vote on whether the whaling would continue for the next year. And so they were unable to break that stalemate, for 30 years. But with this politics ebb and flow, and there's always the chance that subsistence hunt could get shut down, which the Inuit definitely don't want. It's critical for their identity and who they are and for the way they live. And so one of the things AUWC was very clear on, and I felt important, was not to show really to just decrease the amount of implied violence. Don't show blood, etc. Those kinds of things. And I think that I very much recognize that is totally true, and that in a lot of ways you can make a film that is just as powerful, or if not more powerful, by not showing the portion of it that is the violence. It's because that part of it in a lot of ways is the part that gets glorified and isn't really what whaling is about. If you ask any hunter up there what like about whaling, it definitely tell you that throwing the harpoon is just a tiny little portion of what it means to be whaling. Whaling is really about community. It's about people getting together to work hard together. It's about the gift of the whale and spiritual connection to bowhead whales and the ocean and all of it. There's so much that defies our cultural expectations of what whaling is, that to take it out of the context of what people already know and show them just show them a bunch of things that they've never seen before is really, in a sense, what I was trying to do. Just give them a sense that this is something that's very different and you don't understand it. I don't know if that's successful per se, but that's certainly like the goal, my lifelong goal in almost all of my work that involves Native peoples, is to help people understand that you don't know, you can't see from their cultural point of view unless you spend a lot of time embedded in it.
Was it a possibility that you might not even be able to release a film like this because of opposition from the indigenous community, or even from people who are against whaling?
No, I wasn't worried about it, because in the process of making a film, well, working around indigenous communities, one of the things that I think people don't know at all, but is really clear to us who are also Native, is that there's a protocol for permissions. In Western cultures, you essentially are allowed to do anything you want to unless someone says you cannot. With Native cultures, and I would say a lot of other cultures around the world, you're generally not allowed to do anything unless you're specifically allowed to do it. Right? And so it's very different. So as I was working on the film, or even before, I had all my conversations with the Eskimo Whaling Commission, with all the captains, especially, my crew. And, the whole time we're having these constant conversations about the film and trying to make sure that they not only approved of it, but that we were getting the story right, that we were going to do the best job possible, And so I talked to lots and lots of people, and they all felt that it was going to be a great thing. It's going to be a good thing to have done it, But it's a big responsibility. Putting a film like this out into the world can start fires, and those can be good fires or bad fires, depending on what it is. We also had those conversations at National Geographic as well, in our print story, trying to figure out what we could show, what we couldn't show, and how to best describe it. At the Geographic, they're good at it, because they deal with a lot of these thorny issues all the time. In journalism, we're dealing with these thorny issues all the time. And it was one of the reasons why we have more and more Indigenous photographers, Indigenous reporters at places like National Geographic, so that we have the ability to have a native perspective on while we're making these choices.
A big problem for documentary filmmakers is access. How were you able to get access to this community and gain their trust so that you can do your photography and do the video?
Well, I mean, I would say that the process of it is not unique to me at all, really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as a photographer, my primary asset in a lot of ways is time. With time, you can accomplish almost anything. And it's this kind of Western impatience, which is what will ruin it for you. There's some level of like who you are as a person that really matters too. But so I went in with both these things, like I try my best to just be a really good person. And I try to give myself as much time as I possibly can have. I went up to Utqiaġvik the first time, and on the plane, I was just friendly, and I talked to people up there, we had a lot of common. Like, I'm from a subarctic indigenous culture, and people were really curious about me as well, But I met a whaling captain's wife in Anaiyyun on the plane, and after we got to know each other, she invited me over to come over to her place and come have some maktak. And meet the co-captain. And so I did. And I think that they very quickly understood that I wasn't just a wallflower. Like there were things that had to happen, like taking care of the kids, like washing the kids. There was things like they needed help butchering seals, which I, already knew how to do. And lots of other things, like that need to be taken care of. So from just really simple things like moving boxes around, etc. But I'm there for that. Like I might be a photographer, but it's amazing. And you think that this would be like a common sense sort of thing to do when you're a guest and around other people, even if you're not a guest. If you're just around your friends, like it was sort of a common sense thing to do. Like I was raised that way. Certainly. I'm sure you understand this, Andrew. Like, as a child of immigrants, you're not raised to stand around while other people do things. It's just not right. But it's amazing to me when I do run into foreign reporters, and especially around Native communities, people do a lot of this. They just turn into wallflowers. They stand around while everyone else is doing work, and even worse, try to interrupt what work they're doing by talking to them or by asking them to pose or do whatever, and I try my best not to do that. And so I think people recognize that I'm not just around to do this thing that they don't understand very well, photography, but I'm around to be their human being, that there's a point and a purpose to having me around them, that it's fortunate. And then, just went out meeting people, talking to them, and really seeking to understand from their cultural point of view what's going on. And so I think building that trust is a thing that takes a lot of time, but it also takes repeat visits. Folks in remote communities will often see people and then they won't see them again, ever again. And it really helps to come back over and over and over so that they know, like when my crew got a whale a couple of years ago, one of the first things they did was to call me on the phone and say, "Hey, we got a whale." And they were so excited. And they had to call me and tell me that from out there on the sea ice because I was part of the crew.
Wow,
and I
cool.
think that, that just speaks a lot and says a lot about like my role in their world and in their community. Like, I don't necessarily know that I was thinking about it in terms of access per se, but it was more like, how do I become the best community member and be part of this family that, and then the photography and all of it is important, but it's secondary.
Wow. Cool. Do you still go up there for every season for the whale hunt?
I do. I do. I went this year, and I'm off next year for sure. Definitely. Yeah, I wouldn't miss it. It's one of my favorite places in the world, one of my favorite communities, and it's just there's so many lessons I take back from the things that are going on there. The way people live and the way people do things, but also they're just all my friends. They're like in a lot of ways they're my surrogate community now. Like thanks to communism, my parents were kicked out, or my parents and grandparents were kicked out of our ancestral homeland, so this is my circuit community, and they've adopted me, and I feel really comfortable there. I'm comfortable just about anywhere that I go to a certain degree, but this community gives me something that I can't get anyplace else. So I love it there. I have
Wow, that's
all my
fantastic.
friends there. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I guess we should talk about Greenland style.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
How did you first get involved in Greenland style kayaking?
Well, I think I got involved in Greenland stuff because of skin boats. After building skin boats, it's sort of impossible not to get pulled into this world of Greenland
Hmm.
stuff. I think initially I was very resistant to getting involved in Greenlandic kind of stuff, precisely because I think even before I knew I was Indigenous, I always still had this notion that one like that culture belongs to a community, and that you don't really just want to duplicate another culture's things without being from that, and so when I was building skin boats, I was always trying my best to make them not generic, but to be modern, to do things that we do with them, and to not do things like go after something like what people were calling Greenland paddles, without knowing where they came from or what they were for or any of that, and so it kind of took me a long time to get around the idea of it, but I learned a bunch more about Greenland paddles and Greenland kayak, and also, just all of that from being around the traditional kayak community. But I think more than anything, also from Ligek, who was the first Greenlander that I knew that was involved with kayak stuff.
Hmm.
And I think talking to him and being around all of that made me realize that what was happening in the traditional kayaking community was given to it. It's one thing to steal a culture's, I guess, things that are part of its own identity. It's another thing to be gifted with them, and I think that kind of opened the door for me to understand, to like want to learn and know a little bit more about Greenland and what was going on. But I was never really that interested in Greenland paddles for the sake of Greenland paddles or Greenland kayaks, because all of it didn't seem particularly practical to me. Also, as a kayaker, I was always just mostly interested in going out to sea and doing long expedition trips, packing all my gear in there and going out for 2 weeks or going out for a month, and then foraging and fishing and hunting and doing all those kinds of things from the kayak, rather than using it to go out and learn how to roll and do these kinds of things that were sport essentially.
Hmm.
But yeah, like I think the more I learned about it, the more I started to understand how all these things were integrated. And I started to get a better sense of why Greenlanders evolved their boats to be a certain way. All of that kind of made more sense to me. And then meeting Miligek and John Peterson and folks like that, it starts to all come together as a system, and also made more sense to me from a cultural point of view, the way that people live and what they're trying to do, etc. It wasn't until I went to Greenland for the first time that all of it really started to click, and as you started to see, despite having spent quite a lot of time in the Alaskan Arctic among Alaska's Inuit peoples, Greenland has a very different flavor to it. Even though Alaska's Inuit people can speak, their dialect essentially is understandable by Greenlanders and the other
Oh,
way
really?
around.
Wow.
Yeah. All the Inuit languages are essentially one language. You can almost look at it as the same way kind of that English is. It's awfully difficult for, say, like an American to understand a Scottish dock worker,
Hmm.
right? Except that thick accent, right? And that's kind of the same thing, but multiplied, multiplied a few times more, just because of the distance and the isolation between the languages. But people in Greenland will say that, like, when they're talking to an Alaskan Inuit, that sounds like their grandfather used to sound, or something like that.
Oh,
It's
wow.
just really funny. I love it. I love that bit of it. So yeah, I think going to Greenland and being over there, I had planned to be in Greenland anyway, and it just so happened that Miligek invited me to come up and be there for the Greenland Kayaking Championships, and so I just moved my flight like a couple of weeks and was able to intersect with all of that at the same time, and so that turned out to be great. I really enjoyed being there. And I have since been many times now working on different stories and just, getting to know Greenland from a point of view of a lot more than kayaks. Greenland's a particularly amazing place. And the kayaks are a symptom of what makes it interesting, but not the main point of interest for me. In a lot of ways, I think Greenland is amazing because it is essentially one of the only indigenous countries on Earth. It's built and founded on indigenous principles. It's semi-autonomous from Denmark. It's almost autonomous, almost completely autonomous from Denmark. It has its own government, and it's built on indigenous principles, which some would say socialist, but I would say this is way before socialism appeared. Like, for example, in Greenland, you can't own private property. There's no private property in Greenland. Wow. Land is communal. Let's say not private property. You can't own the land. No one can own the land. The land is communal property owned by all Greenlanders, and that's very strongly an indigenous concept. The idea that you can own the land is something that really changed with the advent of agriculturalists. Because if you've got your crops somewhere, then that's essentially your land. If someone else comes up on your land and it does anything with that land, they're destroying your crops and your ability to eat. So, but anyway, like I was sort of getting off on a tangent, I just wanted to say that essentially Greenland has done a lot of amazing things that when you look around the world, it's hard to imagine or see analogs to. That they've done an amazing job of preserving and managing their marine mammal population, and they have preserved and brought back to life many of their cultural traditions, like kayaking. They still hunt narwhal from kayak today. In fact, in the spring season, the early spring season is the only way they'll hunt. They have Greenlandic Huskies are the only breed of dog allowed in North Greenland because they want to preserve the breed as a working breed, because sled dogs are still one of the most important forms of transportation up there. And that is not because they don't have snow machines, but because they, as a government, or not just as a government, as a people, they've decided that hunting for caribou, hunting for muskox has to be done by sled dog. It's a way of self-limiting their take on the natural world and all of that. So all of the kind of stuff goes together. But at the same time, too, Greenland has one of the highest standards of living in the world. You're not looking at a third world country or developing nation. They're not rich, but they live very well. And they eat very well, and they have family and community. So in a lot of ways, Greenland is just a kind of like a model society that we could learn, much of the world could stand to learn a lot from.
Wow. How do they balance hunting and preserving the marine mammal population?
I'm actually doing a story, a grant-funded story for Geographic on this particular thing. But one of the ways that it's done is it helps, for one, that Greenland has a small population relative to the amount of land that they have. But it's less of a big deal than you might think it is, because Greenland, even though it's a huge island, you can't use any of the interior. Because of the Greenland's ice cap, it covers almost all the land in the interior. So essentially, people just live in these little strips along the coastlines. So although the population is low, it's not actually that much land that is there. So they're essentially all sea people. They're an island nation, and almost all the food comes from the ocean. It's fish and whales and other marine mammals are the primary foods, and then there's a little tiny bit of reindeer and muskox and stuff like that. And so a lot of the way that animals are preserved or their hunting is preserved is through local hunting councils. So local hunting councils are composed of hunters who hunt that particular thing. And in each region, the hunting councils are composed of all the hunters, and they get a little bit of input from scientists as well, kind of to look at the conditions. But they also recognize that the people who know the most about what's going on with a population are the hunters, who are looking at it every year in detail, who are making these detailed observations. The hunters get together and they decide on their own internal set quotas, and it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's not just quotas, but it's like, we should hunt here at this time. We should hunt here at this time, but not here because last year this is where the pregnant narwhals were feeding. So there's this like very much more advanced understanding of what's going on. with the amount of observation that people have. And so managing all of that is really sophisticated, but the Western world just doesn't really see it that way. But it's there.
Wow. Do you think these are traditional ways of managing the
Yes,
populations?
they are. I mean, a lot of it is, modified. It's just different than it used to be. Greenland was still colonized, even though, of course, it has done very well for itself. It hasn't been colonized, so a lot of things have changed. But the hunting councils are absolutely related to their original form of communal decision making about these kinds of things as well.
Wow, fascinating. Do you think there's a danger in cultural appropriation of the Greenland kayaking tradition?
I mean, I think there's a little bit of a danger of it. I wouldn't
Mhm.
say that it's a big danger because I think that Greenland is like I said, it's very much given. It's tried to spread and encourage people to be involved with Greenlandic style kayaking because, well, for a number of reasons. I mean, they're not doing it just out of goodwill. They're doing it because it serves their own purposes. I think Greenlanders recognize in the end that by making this sport popular around the world, it brings in money and tourism, and it also encourages their own people to be interested in it. By making something international, it elevates the sport at an international level,
Okay.
makes it, all of these things. And so I think that they think that this is a good and important thing. But they made that choice, and I think that's the difference between cultural appropriation versus something like this is when you don't ask permission and you do it.
Yeah. Hmm.
I will say though that I think that you do see kind of a lot of the odd, goofy kind of things that do happen when you don't have any direct contact with Greenland or where things come from. It's just like I heard from this person or I learned from this person who learned from this person who learned from this person, none of which have any direct connection to Greenland. Eventually a lot of the stuff gets lost and the spirit of things gets lost. And some of it evolves on its own too. Like right now, for example, the Greenlandic paddles, Greenlandic kayak paddles, modern Greenland paddles are not shaped the way that the traditional kayaking community in the lower 48 has them, or the way that it's kind of evolved globally. So it's kind of taken on its own thing, but they don't have rounded tips. they have diamond shaped tips.
You mean
They
in
have,
Greenland?
yeah, in Greenland. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah, in Greenland, they have diamond shaped tips, except for sport paddles, So for paddles, they're just used for rolling, then they're like that. But in hunting communities where the paddles are actually used on kayaks for hunting, they have diamond shaped tips because they're used as a weapon of last resort. And not only that, the diamond pointed tips also make it easier to sneak up on something because of the dripping. It channels the dripping down to a single point, and you can soften and quiet that dripping because you know where it's going to come off of the paddle. So all those kinds of things.
Oh, wow.
Very interesting. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so these are modern Greenland paddles made in Greenland that are used for hunting.
Yes.
So there is still a practice in using kayaks for hunting.
Oh, yeah, there is. Uh-huh. Yep. Not all the communities do it. The further north that you go, the more likely it is done. But especially in Umanak and Kanak, those areas, they're definitely using kayaks for hunting. And in
Ah,
fact, actually, that's one of the ways that they preserve narwhals. Is that it's kayak only for a certain portion for the majority of the season, and that's part of how they are mitigating their impact on narwhal.
okay. Do their hunting kayaks look like the kayaks that are used in competition?
The hunting kayaks are kind of all over the place, really. You actually find, I think, probably I would say the majority of kayaks are actually store-bought kayaks that come from someplace else,
Okay.
and modern commercial sea kayaks, most of which are pretty nice, but it's just a matter of resources, knowledge, and all that kind of stuff. The majority of them are just modern sea kayaks that people use to get out there and hunt with, because not everyone has access to the knowledge or the people who have the knowledge and the time in order to build them, and et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm. Hey, I wanted to revisit the project that I first knew you for, which was
Hmm.
when you had skinned a kayak using a cowhide.
Oh yeah, right. Uh-huh.
How did that idea
Hmm.
come up? You first get the idea for that.
Well, I was building skin boats, and it was sort of a natural inclination to want to do all of it and learn all of it. I guess I think probably part of also because I was involved in primitive skills and bushcraft. So I really wanted to learn like how you could do all of it without using nylon for skin, and I knew that there was going to be a lot of technique and skill involved that I just didn't know, and I would learn a lot in the process of doing it. I don't know. I also thought it would be beautiful. It would teach me things that I didn't know that I even had questions for, and that's certainly what happened. Definitely. I sewed the two cow skins on, which I call slow elk, or land walrus is what I called them at the time, I think. In the process, I learned a lot about, just hide selection. I learned a lot about. For one, like I learned that things like cow hides are so incredibly, they shrink a tremendous amount because eventually the frame for that kayak was crushed.
Yeah.
In the compression of it. So I learned a lot about the sewing techniques. I learned a lot about how to seal up and use different stitches. I learned about like subcutaneous stitching and lacing and all of that. And then kind of had to relearn a lot of stuff. But the more that you work with hides, the more that you understand hides. Like the different species of animals all have different characteristics. I feel really bad for people that lived in kayak building areas that only had caribou skins to skin their boats with, because caribou are incredibly difficult to skin a kayak with. They're really thin. They're very tough, actually. They're tougher than a lot of other skins are relative to their thickness, but they're very, very thin. So making subcutaneous stitches where you go in one side and don't come out the other side, but you kind of loop back out around, is extremely difficult. And you're making like 30 stitches per inch, something like that. Anywhere between 10 and 30 stitches per inch. Yeah. So it's really difficult. You learn about all that kind of stuff. It was magic. I learned a lot, and it was a beautiful kayak. And one of the things that I probably didn't know that I really learned was once you skin it with real hides, how much kayak is a living thing. If you don't paddle it enough, and the skins will either burst at the seams or the frame will get crushed. So. And it misses you. It's like a child or part of your family. Like you have to give it love, or else it dies.
Aren't the skins usually taken off in the wintertime?
Yeah, yes, that's true. They're often taken off in the winter, but it's there's kind of a rule of thumb, but it's not true across the board.
Okay.
And all, good example of this was like with Umya. They basically say, we would take this off every 3 or 4 years. We'll cycle out a new skin, But some people have their skins on there for 10 years. Some of them reskin every year. Mm-hmm. Some people will take off the sewn skins every year and then lace them back onto them in the spring every year. There's all kinds of different ways of doing stuff. There's that kind of wild amount of variation, but it also varies depending on the skill of the people who sewed your skins, etc. Maybe if you're a really good set of sewers that do a great job, then your skin will last 10 years. And if you don't, then you can't wait to get rid of it and get new skins sewn on by different people.
Can you talk about building modern skin-on frames now? I know you hold classes and workshops on doing that.
Well, yeah, it's been a long evolution. I think originally I was building them Badarka style from Corey Friedman's style of building. And, Corey's very skilled with hull shapes, and he's built so many hundreds of boats and he's like me now with students. Every time you build a boat, you learn just as much as if you had built your own boat. Not quite, but almost. Mm-hmm. And with all the variations, learn about how it all handles. And when I first began building kayak, I was building tons of them. I was just building them day in and day out. 1 every 2 weeks for the first year or two that I was building them. I was building a lot. And I'd get sick of it, and then I'd take it apart and use the wood to build another boat somewhere else. So a lot of that was trial and error. You learn by experimentation, And then also early on, I met Brian Schultz from Cape Falcon, and he was building stuff too. And I think he had a lot of influence on me in terms of talking about building modern boats as opposed to just replicas of things. And he had a similar philosophy to me, which is you build them for modern uses, not as replicas. But I think Brian has a very particular focus on kayak that go in and out through surf zones, so he was always kind of building towards this goal in mind. And being around him really helped me understand things like buoyancy in the ends of the boat and stability and surfing capability for those things. Like probably things would have been easy to gloss over, especially in the beginning when I was building it, because almost nobody is surfing their skin on frame sea kayak in big ocean surf. It's just like a very, 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 very tiny minority of people on this earth that are doing something like that. But nonetheless, there are important things to learn, and you learn a lot in the process of designing things for a specific function. And so I was doing a lot of that. But, eventually I started to look around, and, like the more that you build kayaks, the more that you look at other boats when they're around. I look at other kayaks on the tops of cars. I'd paddle other kayaks. I'd go rent modern kayaks and then paddle them, take them out for a test spin, and then look at their hull and, make notes mentally. Sometimes I actually physically make notes. There are times when I rent a kayak, take it home, and then take the lines off of them using laser levels and things like that, all kinds of crazy stuff, so that I could get accurate dimensions off of them. And then I would build replicas of those, I would build something that was very similar to that boat that I liked for whatever reason. And I learned from it. And so there's always something like that going on. And then in class, in our courses, there's always students who wanted to customize it for this or that. In the beginning, I was always like, let's do it, Later on, as my design skills got better and better, and I knew more and more about what would happen if students didn't know, I discouraged it sometimes. But I also like to let people have their experiments so that we would all learn from it, and that was a big part of the process too. So, like at this point now, having built with students probably, close to 1,000 kayak,
wow.
There's just been a lot of iteration. You learn a lot, and I probably paddled 75 different models for kayaks, and so in all kinds of varying conditions, and done a lot of expeditionary style stuff. So I've learned a lot about the way that kayaks handle different situations, and all of that kind of informs my decisions about how to build boats. And then I think the biggest probable realization of all early on is that there's no single boat that does everything well. If you're just going to do anything well, you've got to choose. You get like two options. It could do 2 out of the 5 major things that are required to do really well, and do the other things serviceably. So you have to design your boat with that specific thing in mind. Which is why we have a bunch of different models. We have like a fast and long sea kayak that a lot of advanced paddlers like, but then we also have like a fast and long, but also extremely low volume, small kayak that is for people who don't weigh very much, who aren't very tall. For example, a lot of female paddlers who also are advanced paddlers, and that's just not like a kind of thing that people like that do very well in if they don't have that specific type of boat made for them, designed around them. So yeah, that's kind of my design philosophy, is we make things for exactly what it is that we want to use them for. This is one of the advantages of doing skin on frame versus commercial kayak building.
Yeah.
Right. Like commercial kayaks, if it's a plastic boat, you got to build a die for your rotor molded bolt, and that die is expensive. So you have to produce, several thousand of them to really make it worth it.
Oh yeah.
And with fiberglass, of course, there's more customization allowed. But I can literally in 3 days come up with a prototype for a new kayak and be paddling it with whatever tweak or thought I have in my imagination, with so little investment of money, right? And so that there's all of that.
Yeah, skin on frame is an amazing technique. The one challenge that I've had with it, though, is the reproducibility. I can never make the same kayak twice.
I've gotten pretty good at making them highly reproducible, but I think that has come from doing it in courses where we have to teach people how to bend the ribs exactly the same from person to person, and there's still variation in the boats, of course, especially because people are doing it often for the first time, but they're remarkably close and very similar model-wise, and we've just learned how to do it, mark rib bending areas, teach the technique so that people get it down the exact same way in terms of how to bend the ribs, and then we make sure that our measurements are taken at enough stations that people know exactly how they're building the widths out exactly right, and the shape of the gunnels, which determine everything else, So it's all kind of locked in a lot of ways. But that just comes from having made the process smooth and easy for people. In the process, you find ways to standardize things, and so that has greatly increased the reproducibility of all the boats for sure.
Well, they've definitely been successful, and I am the proud owner of one of your kayaks that was given to us by one of your students, Faux.
Oh, Fox.
Yeah, he took the kayak on an expedition around the north coast of Vancouver Island, and when he was done, gave it to us. So,
Awesome.
yeah, it's a great kayak for camping in.
Yeah, that's what that model is really good for. Yeah, at this point in time now, I think Seawolf is really just winding down. We're just trying to figure out what we're going to do now. Like as a photographer, I've gotten to be so busy that I'm burnt out half the time. And that's not including doing any kayak stuff. And then my primary builder, Addie, she's building all the boats on commission. But, now that we don't have any workshops through COVID, et cetera, we just don't really have time for all that kind of stuff now. So I think we're probably just going to figure out a way to wind down Seawolf in a way where we're teaching maybe like one workshop a year because it's important to me. But I think I'll continue to do like building kayaks for native cultural events and for teaching purposes, but it's going to be like very minimal, relatively speaking, compared to what we were doing before, which is like 5 to 8 courses a year.
Oh, wow.
And dozens of commission boats.
How did you learn how to roll a kayak, and what was that like?
I originally learned how to roll a kayak from Brian Schultz in the pool. Brian was actually very successful with it. He was trying to learn how to teach rolling at that time the best that he could. Doing it his way while learning how to roll, I think was interesting because he was trying all these sort of experimental things. And there were a lot of things that he kind of just forgot to talk about because he was focused on other things, like bracing yourself on the inside of the boat and all kinds of stuff like that. So because of the amount of repetition, we were always doing rolling constantly and working on it a lot. I learned how to roll without even needing to brace the inside of the boat.
Oh,
which was really interesting. Yeah, that's how I recommend people learn to roll. And one of the reasons why I don't put thigh braces inside of the kayaks now, because what I've learned is that if you don't count on bracing on the inside of the boat in a very particular super locked in fashion, and you learn how to roll your kayak that way, you can roll up in the most amazing situations. Because if you capsize, a lot of times you get knocked out of position inside of your kayak, unless it's a very low volume kayak, and then you have to kind of figure out how to get yourself back in. And a lot of people just can't, especially when you're in a panicky under the water situation or partially in the water situation, you're hanging up sideways or underwater. Like we were doing stuff like I quickly translated what Brian was doing over to doing things like once I got decent at rolling, I would just exit the boat and then, I would capsize, get out of the boat, take a breath on the surface with one foot or in my hands still attached to the kayak, then get in upside down and reattach my skirt upside down and then roll back again without ever needing to brace. And what I really discovered was that without bracing on the interior of the boat or counting on a certain position, what happens is that you can do things like scoot yourself forward. Like you can take your feet off the foot braces, scoot yourself forward 6 inches or a foot, and then the angle to the back deck is ultra low.
Yes.
And then you can, just squeeze your legs out a little bit and then roll yourself back up. And it's almost impossible not to roll back up when your center of gravity is so low. So yeah, that's kind of how we got started with learning all that stuff. And the funny thing about it, of course, is that once you learn to roll, then you never really need it again.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, every time I've really needed to roll in practical application, it's been a brace. It's been a high or low brace or something like that, or a partial roll. I've never really gone completely under because you're just so, you got your kayak handling skills and you know how all of that stuff works. So you never really truly capsize again. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
that works.
But learning those roles, you want to test yourself. So you end up putting yourself in those conditions where you'll need to roll. For instance, surf and big currents and high winds, things like that.
Yes, certainly. And certainly I will say surfing, I have definitely gotten knocked over completely, 100%. I've gotten partially knocked out of the boat but thanks to being able to just, reorient in the boat and still been able to come up. But yeah. What I've met also was not that I never get capsized at all. It's just I never get capsized when I'm not out playing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the difference there.
How did you first meet Dubside?
I'm not totally sure. I think I met him actually, at the same time I met Malik at a Greenland week thing put on by the Kayak Academy over in Issaquah. Yeah, he seemed like an interesting, kind of strange guy. Let's start off with at first, but I've certainly gotten to know him a little bit better over time, and he's great. I mean, I think what I love about him more than anything is that he's got this real sense of open curiosity, and he's really interested in learning culture and understanding how to see things from a point of view that's outside of his own. So I feel like he struggles with that particular thing a lot, but struggling through all of it is something that just takes a lot of humility and a lot of patience and perseverance, and I appreciate that about him a lot.
Yeah, he's definitely has this reverence for the Greenlandic culture and this desire to learn as much about it as possible. All right. Anything else you'd like to mention that you think people should know about you?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I would say that if you're interested in this sort of confluence between traditional craft, but also the cultural side of indigenous cultures, then certainly I recommend you check out my Instagram or my website, or tune into some of the talks and public speaking that I give. I'm doing a speaker series through Nat Geo Live next year, and putting out a story on the Geographic on sovereignty of indigenous peoples. And I just think that, like the kinds of stuff that I work on media-wise are all about helping people understand that Native peoples are still here. We're still here, that we are continuing to do stuff, but things look different than they did 500 years ago. I guess there's a sort of constant source of frustration in the global indigenous community that people no longer think we're here because we don't look like we did 500 years ago. That there's been intermarriage among people from the outside, and so we don't like physically look like the same people we did. We're not dressed in the same kinds of clothing, etc. But despite all of those things, that the indigenous core part of our identity is still very much alive, and that there's a vastly huge cultural difference that still exists to this day. And if you don't pay attention, it's completely easy to miss because it's not really visible on the surface. A lot of us have learned to keep that kind of stuff to ourselves when we're not around our family or our own community, but it's there, and there's just sort of almost infinite amount of really interesting stuff to learn and see when you actually have Native peoples around in your life. So my recommendation is, if you're interested in lots of these kind of indigenous technologies and traditions, I highly recommend just getting some indigenous friends and, just being around them, and like pay a little bit less attention to what everyone else is saying about Native peoples, and pay a little bit more attention to what indigenous peoples are saying about ourselves.
That's a great recommendation.
Yeah.
I recommend that people take a look at your website, and I'll put a link in the show notes. There's a great deal of material there. Another question I had, what do you think was your biggest faux pas in dealing with indigenous communities? I mean, were there moments of cultural misunderstandings that came up?
Yeah, I would say probably it would get very long and complicated to explain the particular thing I'm thinking about. But I would say that the biggest, for a very specific incident, but I would say that the biggest and hardest, most difficult thing is understanding Indigenous protocol, because every community has the different protocol for how to give permissions to do things. And learning that protocol is often very difficult and fraught. It feels almost like bureaucratic sometimes, and the pace of which things go is very slow. But it's very important. You have to do it. And I would say that like my biggest struggle has been against this kind of bureaucratic side of protocol sometimes. I mostly really enjoy it because I think a lot of protocol is wonderful. a lot of the protocols there in the first place to force you to slow down, to really understand a culture, how it sees the world. It's forcing you to take a perspective from the culture itself, give you time to learn a little bit before you run off to do something that's going to be incorrect. It's going to represent the people incorrectly or whatever, that kind of thing. And I would say that history has a lot to do with it too. Like the particular incident that I'm thinking of evolved where I went to St. Lawrence Island, which is an island in the Bering Sea between Alaska and Russia. And I was teaching an art therapy class for suicide prevention in the villages up there, which are Siberian Yupik. Those villages up there have the highest rate of suicide in the world, youth suicide in the world. So it's really rough. It's really, really rough. The rate of youth suicide is more than an order of magnitude greater than that of the continental U.S., which is pretty high anyway. Yeah, so it's bad. You have as much as like 6 children in just a couple of months taking their lives.
Wow.
So like things like suicide prevention, of course, are obviously very sensitive. And I went up there to do this and got clear permissions with the community, clear permissions with the school, with the teachers, the principal, and with the parents themselves. But one of the things that I wasn't counting on is not spending enough time to get to know the elders who were involved there. And then part of this is luck too. When I arrived, one of the elders who was in charge of mental health kind of stuff and was off the island, wasn't around, or wouldn't be back for several weeks. And so like towards the end of the time that I was there, she showed up and she was like, I don't know this person. Who is this person teaching suicide prevention stuff? And it's not like I wasn't teaching anything. All I was doing is we're making paper mache masks with the kids. To help them express their feelings of grief and joy. She, in her head, comes from this and understood this long legacy of outside colonial peoples coming in and telling them how, like, running their mental health programs.
Okay.
Becoming leadership and running their mental health programs, basically saying how they should and shouldn't help their own community deal with it. And she's right in that sense, So she showed up and she was like, who is this person? And didn't even really want to talk to me. She was like, he has to leave,
Wow.
And so I eventually smoothed things over, but nonetheless, and I had to cut that project short by a couple of days. And I'm glad I didn't burn any bridges, but it was just one of those great regrets that I have, that I wasn't able to get in touch with everyone and make sure that everyone understood and knew what we were doing, etc. And it's one of the challenges that people up there have, that is just across the board, just kind of to know that wherever I go in the Arctic regions, in native communities, there have been previously other people from the outside, especially reporters and journalists and people like that, who show up with their own preconceived notions of what a place is like. They burn the bridges to the ground. They do a story or an article and talk about how terrible the suicide is in this place, and how the people are doomed, and how their culture is crumbling, et cetera, and then of course no one ever wants them to come back, because that's not actually their story. That's a story that they see from that reporter saw from the outside, but it's not really the story of the people or what's going on there, because he didn't spend enough time there to really understand it. And so, you can't blame anyone for that. I get it. And one of the things that I ended up discovering as I was putting the story together and looking at data and stuff too, is that 10 years prior to that, the suicide rate was incredibly high. But in the 10 years since, the suicide rate had fallen dramatically. And that was partly because mental health services were now completely community-led. You didn't have outsiders working on that. And that was part of the reason why the suicide rate fell so dramatically. Right. So, all of it makes sense. I mean, and you have to remember too, in these particular villages, they are 99% Siberian Yupik. Everyone who's non-Yupik in those places are either a teacher or someone who works for the airline, or some like official person that came from somewhere else and has like sort of a temporary job there, not someone who actually lives in the community. The community is entirely Siberian Yupik. Right? So it gives you an idea of how weird it is to have someone from the outside who's not been your part of your culture, who you don't know really, coming in to teach something about suicide is obviously not what you want.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge risk for them.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, like I say, that's probably my greatest regret. But I think all of it is just part of it is the pain of decolonizing.
Hmm.
Yeah, I have to experience that pain, and they have to experience that pain, and we're all just kind of fumbling our way through, trying to do our best.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much, Kiliii. I know we can talk probably for hours and hours about everything that you've been up to, but thanks so much, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with next.
Yeah, it's great to hear your voice, Andrew. Yeah, fantastic.
Well, that wraps it up for our final episode for the year 2021. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Dubside and I wish you all happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year. And we will be back again next year with more of the Dubcast with Dubside.